Let's talk to the campaign spokesperson, the official campaign spokesperson for the government, Senator Matthias Cormann. Appreciate your company.
Good to be here.
If I could get you to put your finance minister's cap on for the first question, Brexit. You heard Paul's editorial. Is this something that should concern Australia, the decision that has been taken by the UK?
Well, it's obviously a big and momentous decision by the British people. We respect it as a decision by the British people. But from an Australian point of view, yes, I mean, it is one of the external risks that we now will have to deal with moving forward. We are an open trading economy. What happens in the rest of the world matters to us, and what this just demonstrates is the importance of having a stable government with a clear and comprehensive plan for the economy and jobs. And of course the Turnbull government has precisely that. We have the plan to put Australia on the strongest possible economic and fiscal foundation for the future, whereas our opponents just have a plan for bigger deficits, higher taxes and consequently weaker growth and fewer jobs.
What about the two-edged sword that Paul mentioned, though? I mean, this would be a concern potentially for the government, that whilst you might be able to, you know, if you like, make the political point that you just did then about the need for stability off the back of this result in the UK, the flip side is that whether it's discontent with banks or with business more broadly, these are all sentiments that are attempted to be tapped into here domestically by Bill Shorten.
Well, the important thing for Australia is how can we be the most successful we possibly can be into the future, and the way we're going to be the most successful into the future is by making sure that we are as competitive as possible, that we have the best possible opportunity to sell Australian products and services around the world, and that is of course what the Australian government has been focused on. When we came into government in September of 2013, the Australian economy was weakening, unemployment was rising, the budget position was rapidly deteriorating. Fast forward, after we've been working very hard to turn that situation around, the economy in Australia is now stronger, employment growth is stronger, the unemployment rate at 5.7% is below where it had previously been anticipated, and our budget is on track, on a credible path back to balance.
Both Malcolm Turnbull and Julie Bishop, before the vote, indicated that they felt it was in Australia's interests for Britain to remain with the EU. To what extent have we been taken by surprise?
Well, we always have said that this is a decision for the British people. We respect that it is a decision for the British people. Australia at any one point in time faces a series of actual or potential external risks. I mean, this was until Thursday a potential global economic risk, and the decision has now been made. And from Australia's point of view, it is important that we continue to put ourselves in the strongest, most resilient position possible to deal with any global economic headwinds, to deal with any external risks coming our way from time to time, but also to put ourselves in the strongest possible position to take advantage of opportunities. And when it comes to Europe, Australia of course has a very positive and very good relationship with Britain, but we've also been working very hard on having a strong and effective relationship with continental Europe, particularly with France and Germany, and we're of course pursuing the opportunity of a free trade agreement with the European Union as we speak.
We know that the global economy is fragile. We know that world growth is pretty sick these days. And we had very strong warnings before this vote from both the British Treasury and the Bank of England about the downside. So to what extent is the Australian government concerned about the implications for global growth and how this might affect Australia?
Well, obviously what happens in the world matters to Australia. We are an open trading nation, and that is why we have been putting together and we've been implementing our national economic plan for jobs and growth. That's why we're focusing on a more competitive business tax rate. That's why we're focusing on export trade deals, helping Australian exporting businesses be the most successful they can be in exporting Australian products and services into key markets around the world. That's why we're focusing on our innovation agenda to boost investment in startups. That's why we're focused on leveraging the opportunities out of our defence industry plan for local high-end manufacturing and shipbuilding. And what we would say is that we have the plan to ensure that Australia is in the strongest possible position to deal with whatever comes our way, whereas our opponents would put Australia into a weaker position on the back of bigger deficits, which economists say would threaten our AAA credit rating, on the back of higher taxes, more than $100 billion in additional taxes.
Let me just ask you directly, in terms of Labor's position, which is a higher deficit across the forward estimates. To what extent is that now a more risky policy as a result of Brexit?
Well, you know, obviously, the bigger the external risks, the bigger the problem with the sort of big spending, bigger deficits and higher taxes approach that Labor is putting forward.
So it is more dangerous?
Well, you know, we would say that Labor was dangerous to our economy in any event, but obviously the higher the risks and the more the headwinds that we have to deal with, the more dangerous that sort of approach that Labor is promoting would become. You know, Australia at any one point in time should be focused on making ourselves as competitive as possible. So Labor's proposal to increase taxes by more than $100 billion compared to our policy position over the next decade is bad for our economy. It's bad for investment, it's bad for growth, it's bad for jobs. Their proposal to run bigger deficits, I mean, economists...
Do you think they'll change their mind? I mean, given the extent of the global shock, given what's going on in global markets, it'd be pretty extraordinary, wouldn't it, if Labor didn't adjust its position now in the final week of the election?
Well, but in this campaign, every single spending commitment Labor has made in this campaign is unfunded. Labor has made unfunded spending promise after unfunded spending promise, which means that either it cannot be delivered after the election or it would lead to bigger deficits or higher taxes. I mean, and, you know, obviously to this point, Labor has not explained to the Australian people how they would pay for their unfunded spending promises. All they've done is said that they would run bigger deficits over the forward estimates.
So, Senator, given those economic headwinds that we are vulnerable to that you mentioned a moment ago, is there not also a case for the government to reconsider the speed at which it brings the budget back to surplus so there is more flexibility in fiscal policy to respond to some adverse economic headwinds that may come our way?
No. I mean, our plan, which is reflected in the budget, our plan for jobs and growth is calibrated to put Australia on the strongest possible position to deal with whatever comes our way. We have always taken the view that that is our responsibility, to ensure that Australia is in the most resilient position possible to deal with any global economic headwinds coming our way, and that we're in the strongest possible position to take advantage of opportunities coming our way. I mean, we've got to remind ourselves, we are here in the Asia Pacific. I mean, it's not all doom and gloom. We are in the part of the world where most of the global economic growth will be generated for years, if not decades to come. So we need to ensure that we're in the best possible position to take advantage of the opportunities in our region to sell Australian products and services. And that's, of course, what our export trade deals are all about.
But governments obviously have to be responsive to global economic circumstances. Now, you've got spending at 25.8% of GDP this year, projected this year as it was the same last year. Surely there is a need to, at the other side of the election, to reconsider some of the spending commitments that you've made during the election campaign and to actually bring in a more tighter fiscal policy over the forward estimates. Isn't that a sort of a strategy that would give you that flexibility to give certainty to local investors, to local markets and to Australian voters?
Well, it's not quite right. So last year, spending as a share of GDP was at 25.9%. We have been able to bring that down slightly, but to 25.8%. And over the forward estimates, it's projected to go down to 25.2%. So we're now on a downward trajectory when it comes to government spending as a share of GDP. When we came into government, we inherited an upward trajectory, which the National Commission of Audit told us would have gone to 26.5% spending as a share of GDP by 2023-24. So we've been able to halt the increasing trajectory, and we've been reversing the trend, and we're bringing that down now over the forward estimates to 25.2%. What we're focused on is on how we can best strengthen growth, strengthen job creation moving forward, and how we can continue to put the budget back on a sustainable foundation for the future. And of course, the plan is laid out in the budget.
Can I ask you then about trade, because this government has delivered a number of free trade agreements. Will it be a priority for a re-elected coalition government to pursue a free trade agreement with Great Britain?
Well, obviously, over the past 3 years, we've been able to deliver export trade deals with China, South Korea and Japan. Yes, we are absolutely... our next priority is to finalise a free trade agreement, an export trade deal, hopefully with India. We are in negotiations in relation to a free trade agreement with the European Union. I mean, obviously, when it comes to Brexit. I mean, this is only the beginning of the process in relation to the Brexit arrangements. We now, of course, have to wait to see how that process develops over the next 2 years. But yeah, clearly, Australia would be very keen to ensure that we've got the best possible trade relationship with the United Kingdom. And of course, we do this on the foundation of a very good and positive relationship with Britain already.
The coalition is formally launching its campaign today in Sydney in the electorate of Reid under Malcolm Turnbull's leadership. There's a Galaxy poll out today in the Sunday News Limited papers that suggests that were Tony Abbott still the Prime Minister, you'd be a long way behind where you are currently polling under Malcolm Turnbull's leadership. Are you grateful as a big backer back then of Tony Abbott that enough of your colleagues took a different view given that poll?
Look, I know that people like yourself are interested in the history, and I'm focused as part of the Turnbull coalition team on the future for our country. I'm focused on the job that needs to be done to ensure that Australia is on the strongest possible economic and fiscal foundation for the future. That is what we'll be talking about at our launch today. It'll be a launch about our plan for jobs and growth. It'll be a launch really clearly spelling out the choice that the Australian people face in this election between a continuation of stable government with a plan for the economy, a plan for jobs and growth, or on the other hand, the shambles and the chaos that would come with a Shorten-led Labor-Green independent alliance, which would deliver bigger deficits, higher taxes, weaker growth, fewer jobs and weaker borders.
One of the reasons, though, for the early election was to sort of, if you like, get the Senate under control, indeed to get the ABCC legislation through. Is it a failure for the government if it wins but without a sufficiently large majority in the lower house to have that joint sitting to be able to pass the ABCC bills? Indeed, is it a failure if, despite the electoral reform to the Senate, you end up with perhaps an even greater number of crossbenchers with a greater level of disparity amongst them?
Well, look, I'll let, again, people like you dissect the result after it happens. Obviously, it's a matter for the Australian people to determine on the 2nd of July, who they want to support. What we are putting to the Australian people is that this is a very important election with a very important choice. We are working to win the trust of a majority of people in a majority of seats and as much support as possible in the Senate, obviously, for our national economic plan for jobs and growth. I mean, these are uncertain times. This is the time for political stability. This is the time for us to continue to do what needs to be done to secure the successful transition in our economy from record resource investment-driven growth to broader drivers of growth in a strong and more diversified economy.
You've got your launch today with Malcolm Turnbull. Tony Abbott will be there. How are Turnbull and Abbott getting on these days?
They've got a very good professional relationship.
Really?
Well,
is that something that you know?
That's what both of them say. That's what both of them tell me.
Have you spoken to them about it?
At various times I've had conversations with both of them, and I mean, I invite you to ask them.
And what do you think will be the fate of Tony Abbott after the election, assuming a re-elected coalition government?
Well, we're not assuming anything. We're not taking anything for granted. This side of the election, we are working very hard to gain the trust of the Australian people. Should we be successful on the 2nd of July, obviously these are matters for the Prime Minister to determine.
But if they're getting on well, if they're thriving, as you say, surely that means that Tony Abbott would be back in the ministry.
As I say, right now, our focus is on gaining the trust of the Australian people. I'm not taking anything for granted. We're not taking anything for granted. Should we get to that point where we are successful on the 2nd of July, the Prime Minister appropriately would be making these sorts of judgments.
Do you agree with Peter Dutton? Do you think it would be a good thing to see Tony Abbott back on the front bench?
Well, I mean, I think I've answered the question. So, there's obviously a campaign underway. Our focus at the moment is on explaining to the Australian people the choice that is in front of them, the importance for political stability, the importance for us to continue to have the opportunity to implement our plan for jobs and growth.
Well, just on that,
and,
back on the Senate, though, I mean, the government isn't going to be able to implement anything if the Senate looks similar that it did before the DD election, and it may even look worse. So even the company tax cuts, which sit at the absolute heart of what the mandate that you're looking for in the lower house, even if you win the election, there's a very good chance that you can't even get those through the Senate.
Well, we are working to maximise our vote, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. And unlike you, I don't know what the Australian people will decide on the 2nd of July. So let's see what the Australian people decide on the 2nd of July. Obviously, from my point of view, I hope that they strongly support us so that we can effectively implement our plan for jobs and growth on the other side of the election.
During the week, I interviewed Tony Abbott for the Australian newspaper. He acknowledged that there are a number of Conservative voters who are disillusioned with the government and are disappointed about the leadership change in September last year. His advice was that they should vote to re-elect the coalition government, even through gritted teeth, is the words he used. Is that a sentiment that you endorse?
Well, I mean, in this election, the choice is a choice between the continuation of a stable Turnbull government on one hand, or the chaos and dysfunction that would come with a Bill Shorten-led Labor-Green independent alliance, which would lead to bigger deficits, which would threaten our AAA credit rating, higher taxes, which would hurt the economy and cost jobs, and as a result, fewer jobs, and last but not least, weaker borders. So, I mean, we all know that Bill Shorten is being challenged by more than 50 of his members and candidates when it comes to the border protection policies of the government. We know that Labor themselves have already admitted that they would deliver bigger deficits. They've admitted that they would increase taxes by more than $100 billion, all things that would be taking Australia in the wrong direction. And as such, the focus very much for us is to ensure that people across Australia understand the choice that is in front of us.
Yeah, but do you acknowledge that there are some Conservative voters who may be thinking about lodging a protest vote against the government over the leadership change last year?
Well, any vote for any candidate other than a Liberal or National Party candidate in the House of Representatives or in the Senate is a vote for the chaos and dysfunction that would come with a Bill Shorten-led Labor-Green independent alliance. So obviously, as you would expect me to do, my very strong recommendation to people across Australia is to support their Liberal National Party candidates in the House of Representatives and in the Senate.
What we're seeing now is a ferocious campaign by Labor, the Greens, parts of the media and the same-sex lobby against the plebiscite. How committed is the Turnbull government to this plebiscite on same-sex marriage, and would it consider modifying its position post-election?
Well, the answer to the last question is no, and the answer to your first question is we're totally committed to the plebiscite. I mean, the reality is that there is a diversity of views in the Australian community. There are strongly held views on both sides of this debate, and the most appropriate way to resolve a diversity of views is at the ballot box in a democracy.
What's the point of having a plebiscite if you then allow a free vote for your MPs on the other side of it anyway?
Well, I'm very confident that, obviously, again, we can't preempt what the outcome of the plebiscite is going to be, and you seem to be assuming...
But either way, it just doesn't matter what the outcome is because it's a free vote in the Parliament. It's like it's a $150 million opinion poll.
Well, in my view, obviously, in my view, whatever the result of the plebiscite will be carried through the Parliament. I'm very confident of that.
Well, let me just ask you about your own position. To what extent would your own position be influenced or changed by the plebiscite outcome?
Well, I've long been on the public record. Obviously, everybody knows that I'm a supporter of the current definition of marriage as enshrined in the Marriage Act, but I'm long on the record as saying, I will respect whatever the outcome of the plebiscite vote would be. So if the plebiscite carries the proposition in favour of same-sex marriage, I will respect that judgment.
If you're respecting that judgment, are the colleagues that choose not to disrespecting it?
Obviously, people have to make their own judgments in relation to these matters. I can just talk for myself.
What's your response to the argument put by a number of people, such as Penny Wong, that this plebiscite should not go ahead, that it will lead to homophobia, that it will lead to attacks on people, and that this will be unacceptable and damaging?
Well, I don't agree. I've got a greater confidence in the Australian people. This is an issue that has come before the Australian Parliament on a number of occasions. On each occasion that the Parliament has considered this issue, the Parliament has reconfirmed the current definition of marriage, and obviously the coalition has made a decision which I strongly support, to put this question to the Australian people for a more permanent resolution. Now, there is a diversity of views in the Australian community, as I've mentioned. It's a diversity of strong strongly held views which are all legitimate from people's perspectives, and the most appropriate way in a democracy to resolve a difference of opinion is at the ballot box, and that is the course of action that I certainly support.
Senator, there is another opinion poll out today showing a 50-50 two-party preferred vote between the Coalition and Labor. Are you concerned at all that we could in fact see a shock election result that tipped out Campbell Newman and Ted Baillieu in recent elections?
Well, this is a closely fought election. Federal elections are always close. It means that every single vote matters, and our message to the Australian people is that if you want a continuation of stable government, a stable government implementing a plan for jobs and growth, a plan that is already showing success. Our economic growth is stronger when we came into government. Employment growth is stronger when we came into government. The budget is now in a better position in terms of its forward trajectory than when we came into government. So our message to people is that if you want the continuation of a stable government delivering an economic plan for jobs and growth, support your Liberal and National Party candidates.
Finance Minister as well as campaign spokesperson for the Coalition, Senator Matthias Cormann. I know you've got a campaign launch to get to. We appreciate you joining us on Australian Agenda. Thanks very much.
Pleasure.